All right, Rabbi, say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning share. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsor for the month of Shvat, Mrs. Salma Wall, for dedicating all the Sherman Drushos this month with immense gratitude to Hashem for the refuos and the merit of refuah shlema for all of those in need, and the schus of our brave soldiers and the return of our hostages. Our week of learning sponsors, Saeed and Sima Haken, in memory of Saeed's mother, Taji Bahatari Bas Harav Meir Moshe. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah and the Sham will have an aliyah and the family in Kamma. And Yehuda and Bracha Buchwalter, in memory of Asher Buchwalter, Yehuda's father, on the occasion of his first yahrzeit. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Neshama will have an aliyah and the family in Kamma. And of course, we dedicate all of Maseches Bava Kamma Le'ilui Nishmas Master Sergeant Yomi Charush Hashem Yikom Damo. May HaKadosh Baruch Hu provide his Neshama with an aliyah and his family in Kamma. But with that, let us begin. Today's daf is Ayin Vav 76, and we are picking up in Meretz Hashem on Ayin Hem Beis 75b. So if you remember again, we left off a little bit yesterday, kind of in the middle of a new twist of the Gemara. So if you remember again, I was actually thinking maybe we'll just kind of jump in right to not where we left off, but a little bit before. Ela milsa achrisi ika beinayu. It was, we'll say it is 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18 lines up from the bottom. We actually got a little bit further than this, but instead of re-explaining the entire case outside, let's just read it inside again. So the Gemara says, Ela milsa achrisi ika beinayu. The Gemara wants to suggest that there's a separate machlokus in Sumchus and the Chachamim. What's the machlokes? Here we go. Kigom the asu beitrei amrle ganafter. Remember again, you'll remember the case as soon as I begin to say it. Two witnesses come along and say, Ruvain, you stole from Shimon. Amrlahu in ganafti v'tavachti umacharti. Ruvain says, yes, I stole. Not only did I steal, but I also slaughtered and sold. Mihu lo bifnechem ganafti. But rather, what does Reuven say? But you guys who are claiming that I did this, you're lying. I didn't do it in your presence. So it was a very interesting case. So the witnesses are hauling Reuven to court, claiming that he stole. He's admitting that he stole, and he's admitting that he slaughtered and sold. What he's now claiming, however, is that you witnesses who are testifying, you never saw this. You're lying about that. You're lying about that. Va'isi sahadi va'azminhu delo ba'apaihu ganov. So what happened? Then Reuven is incredible. Reuven, the accused thief, brings witnesses to prove that the first set of witnesses are Edim Zommin. Okay, now we'll say that what happens next. Then the Balabayis, Shimon, the victim, right? The victim, the owner of the stolen object. Shimon comes along, and now Shimon brings a third set of witnesses to say that indeed Reuven stole. So we'll say, so now what's the shaila over here? The shaila is that Reuven's going to be chayiv for theft. We understand. The question is, he admitted tvicha umechira. So the shaila is now, is he going to be chayiv in the arba v'chamisha or pater? Ubaldas tvicha kamiflagi. They are arguing ultimately again regarding the hodah and the tvicha. But Rabbanan Savri, the Rabbanan hold, afagav doda digneva machmas edim hu de kamoda. The Rabbanan will say like this: even though when Reuven admitted the theft, Rabbanan said, let's be clear. Why did Reuven admit the theft? Why did he admit it? Because of the witnesses. Now, granted, even though those witnesses turned out to be Edim Zomin, it's those witnesses who nevertheless caused him to go ahead and admit it. So avagav doda digneva machmas edim hu dekamod. Even though Reuven admitted the theft because of edim, hoda de tevicha hodahi upater. Nevertheless, he admitted ultimately his admission regarding the slaughtering and selling is a proper admission, and therefore again they hold that he is pater from the arba v'chamisha. Okay, that's the position of the Rabbanan. Simcha says no. Kevan dahoda digneva machmas edim hu the kamoda the kamoda the tvicha lav hoda. But so therefore again I will say, and therefore halacha ma'aser Simcha says, since at the end of the day he admitted his theft because of the witnesses, therefore again the hoda of the tvicha is not a hoda. V'hanach edim kamai da'azminhu mishalmin tashlume kefel. Therefore again the first witnesses who are made into zomim, they pay kefel. The whole mishalim shlosha leparo shnayim la'ayil, and ultimately again Reuven is going to be on the hook for the arba v'chamisha. Once again, as we spoke about yesterday, remember again in the case of Edim Zomamin. So remember arba v'chamisha. In general, arba v'chamisha. We always call it arba v'chamisha, but always important to note that arba v'chamisha also includes what? Also includes the kefil. also includes the kefil. Okay, so that's the machlokas Rabbanon and Sumchus. It's a very unique and interesting case. Amar Rav Acha bar Ravika. Lo, Rav Acha bar Ravika says, I don't agree with that. The Kuli Alma, Hoda de Tvicha Lav Hodahi. Everyone agrees that an admission regarding slaughtering and selling is not an admission. We'll say, if you remember again, let's go back to yesterday's daf for just a moment. If you remember again, well, I guess we still are in yesterday's daf. So if you remember again, Rav Hamnuna was the one who said that in order for you to say Moda Biknas Potter, what has to happen? What has to happen? Your admission has to make you liable to something. Right? So, but otherwise, if your admission essentially frees you from all responsibility, then ultimately that's not an admission. So therefore, again, where did this come up? This came up in a case where witnesses came along and said, Reuven, you stole. Right? So, okay, so now this says whether Reuven stole. Right after that happens, Reuven says, you know what? I admit I slaughtered and I sold. So Rav Hamnuna said, that's not going to work. Why? Because what does that admission do? That admission frees him from all responsibility, but ultimately, again, does not obligate him in anything. Contrast that with for example, when what? When Reuven says, I admit that I stole. An admission to theft, we'll say, what does that do? What does that do? Right? It obligates you in Keren, but exempts you from Kefel. So that's when we say Moda B'Knas Potter, when your admission by definition ultimately obligates you in something. So that's why the Gemara says over here, so again, everyone's going to agree that simple admission of slaughtering or selling is not the proper admission because you're not obligated in anything. So this is actually a different issue. I would say, in general, there's an interesting concept about Eidos She'i Ata Yochal Lahazima. What happens if you have a testimonial unit, witnesses that cannot be made into Eidim Zomamin? Is such a testimonial unit a valid one or not? Now we'll explain this in just a moment. So the Gemara says, Kigon da Asu Sahadi, for example, witnesses came along, Va'amrile Ganafta. They say to Reuven, you stole. Va'amrlahu, Reuven responds, Ganafti v'tavachti umacharti. And Reuven says, yeah, I stole. Well, again, now he's saying he's admitting, I stole. Not really an admission because the witnesses came along. I stole and I slaughtered and I sold. Mihu lo bifnechem ganafti. But I didn't do it in your presence. In other words, you didn't see me do it. Ala bifnei ploni u ploni. Rather, I did it in front of another set of witnesses. So I says, now what's going on over here? Va'isi sahadi. And now the ganav brings the second set of witnesses. Vaz minhu delo ba'apayu ganav. And now Reuven brings another set of witnesses. And the second set of witnesses testify that the first set could not have seen Reuven steal because, again, that first set of witnesses were with the second somewhere else. Okay? V'now va'asu ploni u ploni va'asidu be'diganav. V'tavachu machar. And I will say a third set of witnesses come along and say that what? The third set of witnesses come along and testify that Reuven stole, slaughtered, and sold. So we'll say, so now here we go. Here's the machlokas. The Rabbanan Savi, the Rabbanan hold that this set of witnesses, ultimately, we'll say, see, here's what's interesting. Here's what's interesting in this case over here. In this case, right, so just follow the progression. First set of witnesses show up. They say, Reuven, you stole. Reuven says, yeah, I stole, I slaughtered, I sold. See, he's admitting the Tavicha and Mechira. He's admitting it. But he claims you guys didn't see it, you're Eidim Zomamin. Reuven now brings second set of witnesses, ultimately again saying that the first set are Eidim Zomamin. Then a third set of witnesses come and testify that Reuven indeed stole, slaughtered, sold. The shaila is, what's the status of the third set? So we'll say, here's the problem. To a certain degree, the third set are not really subject to Hazama. Why are they not subject to Hazama, to the Eidim Zomamin? Because since, technically speaking, Reuven already admitted that he slaughtered and sold, so therefore, again, technically speaking, maybe there wouldn't be a reciprocal punishment for them. So the shaila is, if there's no possibility of reciprocal punishment, perhaps that's not a fit eidos. Interesting idea. And therefore, any eidos that's not subject to the reciprocal punishment of eidim zomen is not an eidos. So the Sumchus holds eidos she'ata yachalazima havi eidos. So Sumchus, on the other hand, holds just because you can't visit a reciprocal punishment upon the eidim does not mean that they are not a proper testimonial unit. So the Gemara says, really, is that, I'm sorry, is that true? But we'll say, but that's not true. So we hold, which is interesting, any eidos, any testimonial unit that is not subject to azama, that is not subject to reciprocal punishment, is not an eidos. In other words, we'll say, essentially what halacha is like this. In order to give testimony, you have to have skin in the game. Right? What's your skin in the game? Your skin in the game is that if it turns out that you're lying, right, you're going to get the same thing that you tried to impose upon the individual who you're testifying about. And we'll say what that does is it just ensures, it's like quality assurance for eidos. It just ensures that people are going to remain serious about providing proper testimony. So we'll say, that's how we paskin say. How could Simcha say that eidos shi'i atayachal hazima is a proper eidos? We'll also listen to this. The Gemara says, "Hanimili heicha delo yada be'eza yom be'eza shah deleka eidos klal aval hacha siyui hu de kamesayele." So Rabbi said, this is very interesting. When do we say eidos shi'i atayachal azima is not an eidos? So we'll say, for example, let's say witnesses show up and they give testimony about something, but they say, you know what, we're not sure exactly when the particular event occurred. Right? We're not sure, did it happen on a Monday, did it happen on a Tuesday, did it happen, at 1 o'clock in the afternoon or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So I'll say that type of eidos we do not accept. Right? Why? Because that's an eidos she'i atayachal lahazima. That's a testimony that is not subject to hazama. Why, Rabbi say? What's the chap of hazama? What's the chap of hazama? That a second set of witnesses say that what? Say that what? The first set could not have seen the event that they're testifying about. Why not? Because at that time and at that place that you're saying you saw, you could not have been there. You were with us at that time. So I will say, and it's very important, if witnesses cannot provide an exact day, location, and time of the event that they are testifying about, then their testimony is simply not accepted. It's not accepted because that is called an eidos shi'ata yachal azima. But even Sumchos will say this case is different. Why is this case different? Because the third set, I will say, the third set ultimately again is coming to support that which Ruvain the thief has already admitted to. Okay. Rabbi Lazar Mishmei Rav Tani. I skipped. Mar Hein Mishalman Kefel. Mar Hein Mashalman Tashlume Kefel Midikamode the Gan of Karen by Shlume. I was going back to the case before. The Gemara said that in this case, if they are found to be Edim Zomin, they would pay Kefel. But why would they pay Kefel? If after all, again, Ruvain the thief is admitting that he stole, that means he's obligating himself in Karen. So at most they should have to pay not Kefel, but again, or is essentially another Karen to make up the Kefel. So Rabbi Lazar Mishmei Rav Tani top of Ayin. Rabbi say top of 76. Tashlum the Kefel. Inachinai Rabbi say in that case over here, when it says that they pay Kefel, it's not literally that they pay Kefel, but rather again they pay the additional amount to get up to the Kefel amount. So Rabbi say, let's pause here. Actually, let's get a little bit. Actually, let's pause here for just a second and just catch up a little bit on some of the halacha l'maisa. So we'll say, so we have two things outstanding over here, right? Number one issue that we have to deal with is the machlokes ultimately again of hoda b'knas v'achar kach bo edim. Right? What happens if a person, right, Ruvain steals from Shimon, he admits that he stole. So he's moda b'knas. What's the halacha by moda b'knas? What's the halacha? Moda b'knas? Potter. So what happens if Ruvain admits the theft? What's going to be the halacha? Right, he's chayv in Karen, potter in Kefel. What happens if witnesses come afterwards? Right, that was our case. That was our machlokes Rav and Shmuel that we saw before. Right, machlokes Rav and Shmuel about moda b'knas va'achar kach bo edim. So what's the halacha in that case? So now the Rambam paskins in this in Hilchos Keneva, Perek Gimel Halacha Ches, misha hoda b'knas va'achar kach bo edim. If somebody admitted a penalty, right? So Reuven admitted that he stole, and therefore again that admission exempts him from kefel, obligates him in Karen. Then witnesses come along and testify that Ruvain stole from Shimon. Im hoda betchila b'fnei bezdin ube bezdin pater aval im hoda chutz lebezdin o shoda b'fnei shnayim bilvad the achar kach bo edim harezim mishalim knas avin. So we'll say Rabbi makes an interesting distinction over here. As long as Ruvain had a proper hoda, and we'll say what's the definition of a proper hoda? A hoda done in bezdin. Right? Remember again, this goes back to the story of Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Yoshua. Right? So again, remember, as long as there was a proper hodah in front of a Beis Din, Ruvain is now going to be pater from the knas, even if witnesses subsequently come along and testify about his infraction. However, if Ruvain admitted, but not in the presence of a Beis Din, such an admission is not considered to be a halachically recognized admission, and therefore halacha l'maisa, if witnesses subsequently come, Ruvain is going to be chayiv for that knas. So essentially, we paskin modeh b'knas, the achar kach bo edim is pater, as long as the hoda'ah was done in front of a Beis Din. If the hoda'ah was not done in front of a Beis Din, then ultimately again Ruvain will be chayiv. Incredible. Good. So both say, so now along those same lines, we also paskin like Rav Hamnuna. This is the other piece I was outstanding. I will say, namely what? That when do we say modeh b'knas is pater? When do we say that? Only in a situation where your hoda'ah obligates you in something. But if your hoda'ah absolves you of everything, then at the end of the day, then there is no patur. So, for example, what's a paradigmatic case of modeh b'knas pater? I admit that I stole. So now that I admit that I stole, what am I doing through that admission? I obligate myself in Keren, and therefore I exempt myself in Kefel. But if witnesses come along and say, Ruvain, you stole, right? They obligate Ruvain now in Kefel. Ruvain says, yeah, I stole, and I also slaughtered and sold. That admission will not free him from liability for Arba v'chamisha. Why not? Because that admission does not obligate him in anything. And once it doesn't obligate him in anything, therefore it's not a proper hodah. We'll say a really profound use. So there's also, I think, a profound hashkafic piece in this. I will say, the first step in tshuva, one of the steps in tshuva is a hodah, is an admission, a recognition ultimately again that I committed an avera. I will say, so sometimes a person could say, I recognize I committed the avera, but it wasn't my fault. In other words, I own the fact that I committed the action, but at the end of the day, whatever circumstances beyond my control. That's not real tshuva. Just like modeh b'knas pater only works if you are obligated to do something. So it's Rabbi say hodah, admission of responsibility in tshuva, also only works if lamaisa you have an assumption of responsibility. In other words, to admit something but not be left with any responsibility for it is not called an admission. Only if you admit and then there's some ownership and responsibility, that's a hodah. Otherwise, again, it's just empty words. Incredible Yisrael. So let's go weiter. So now again, we find ourselves 2 dots, Ayin Vav Amud Aleph. Gana v'hikdish v'achar kach tavach u'machar. Next. So now Ruvain went ahead, he stole. Now watch this case. He stole, he was makdish the animal, and then afterwards he slaughtered and he sold it. Okay, so in this case again, the Mishnah said, Ganav v'tavach, v'achar kach. Ganav v'hikdish, v'achar tavach u'machar, m'shan tashlum kefil, v'en m'shan tashlum midalab hay. So we'll say in this case over here, the ganav will be chayiv for kefil, but he will be pater for dalid v'hei, arba v'chamisha. So let's analyze this. Says the Gemara, Amri, bishlam atavicha lo mechayiv. I understand why Ruvain won't be chayiv for slaughtering the animal. Why? Now I will say, and I remember again what's happened over here. Ruvain stole the animal from Shimon. After Ruvain stole the animal, ultimately again he went ahead and he was makdish it. So we'll say, so now first I'll take a quick look at Rashi. Rashi says, second Rashi from the top, the katavach, the hektish. I'm sorry, before we get to that. So now we'll say, so now the Gemara is saying like this. When Ruvain subsequently slaughters the animal, whose animal is he slaughtering? It's not Shimon's anymore, right? Because Ruvain was makdish it. So the animal that he's slaughtering is the animal of hekdish. Now Rashi points out something very, look at Rashi. Katavach the hekdish, katavach, Rashi says, Daha bela achar yeyosh kaiminon, di'i lifnei yeyosh lo kidsha, v'cheven di'yayish kanye hekdish, beyeyosh shine rishus, hilchach lav demari katavach. So Rashi just points out over here, we must be talking about a case where Shimon, the victim, had yeyosh. So now that Shimon had yeyosh, the animal is no longer his. So because it's no longer his, when Ruvain is makdish it, Ruvain has the ability to do so, and therefore when Ruvain subsequently slaughters the animal, he's slaughtering an animal of hekdish. Slaughtering an animal of Hagdish. So the Gemara says, V'lo demari katavach. So now it makes sense. The Gemara says, so now I understand, that's why he's not going to be chayiv for arba v'chamisha. So the Gemara says, 1 second, Ela Hagdish l'chayiv. But I will say, but I don't understand, it's actually interesting. Why don't we say it should be chayiv arba v'chamisha for the act of being makdish something? Both remember again, when do you incur the liability for arba v'chamisha? When do you incur that liability? Either for what? Slaughtering or selling. What is actually interesting? Why not say that the act of being makdish something is the equivalent of selling it? In other words, what does it matter if Reuven sells it to Levi or Reuven, quote unquote, sells it to Hekdish? In other words, either way, you're transferring an item from your the thief's domain to another domain. So why not make him chayiv arba v'chamisha for the act of being makdish it? Ela ahekdish lichayiv mali machro lehedyet mali machro l'shamayim. What does it matter if you sell it to a regular guy? What does it matter, quote unquote, if you sell it to Hekdish? Obviously, you understand, you're not literally selling it to Hekdish, right? The act of being makdish it is giving it over to the Beis Hamikdash, but still, like logistically, the Gemara says, why should it be any different? Hamani, whose opinion does this reflect? Rabbi Shimon here. Both say this is Rabbi Shimon. What does Rabbi Shimon say? The Amar Kachim Shechai Bachar Yusan Birshusei Dimare Kaimi. They both say this is Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon holds that when it comes to consecrated items over which you have responsibility, in other words, that if something were to happen to the consecrated item, you'd be chayiv for replacement or for anything like that, they are considered as if they're still in your domain. So both say, therefore Rabbi Shimon says that essentially, even when you're makdish something, if you bear responsibility for it as much as it's hagdish, it's still considered to be in your domain. Because it's considered to be in your domain, therefore, halacha l'maisa, you can't equate this to a case of mechira, to a case of sale. Take a look at Rashi. Rashi, Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi say, last white line on top, kigon, shama hare alai ola. So for example, the Gemara brings an example, let's say you say this is, right, again, it's just to paint the case. Reuven steals the animal from Shimon, Reuven takes the animal, Reuven says, this animal is an ola. This animal is an ola, okay. The hefresh geneva zulin nidro. The chevan the chayiv. I'm sorry, I take it back. Reuven steals an animal from Shimon. Afterwards, Reuven makes a neder hare alai ola. I hereby take upon myself to go ahead and bring an ola, and he decides to use this stolen animal to satisfy his obligation. So watch this. The Gemara says the chevan the chayiv bachar yuso the davar garim lamamon hu kimamon dami v'lam mechirahi miu le'inyan tvicha pater. So now listen to this. So therefore, again, we're going to see Rabbi Shimon holds that since if something were to happen to this animal, I would be chayiv to replace it. So therefore, even though, so to speak, I'm being makdish it, it's still mine. It's still in my possession. Therefore, it can't be equated as a sale to hekdish. Okay? So the Gemara says, 1 second. So now you want to say, so now let's go through this for just a second. So now what we're saying is like this. If Reuven steals an animal from Shimon, and he goes and he's makdish it, he's chayiv, and there, even if he goes ahead and subsequently slaughters it and sells it, he's only chayiv kefal, not chayiv arba v'chamisha. Why is he not chayiv arba v'chamisha? So very simply, the Gemara says, because if he slaughters it, he's not slaughtering Shimon's animal, he's slaughtering Hekdish's animal. The Gemara says, but why not treat the act of being makdish the animal like an act of a sale, and therefore be chayiv like that? The Gemara says, because we're reflecting the view of Rabbi Shimon, and Rabbi Shimon says that for certain types of karbanos, we'll get more into this in just a little bit, Rabbi Shimon holds that halacha l'maisa, any karban that you have achrayis for, achrayis means if something happens to it, you would have to replace it, it's as if that animal is still in your rishos. Even though it's hektish, it's as if it's still in your rishos. So therefore, in this case over here, since if something were to happen to the animal, so right, Reuven the thief would be chayiv to go ahead and replace it, therefore halacha l'maisa, it's not considered as if he sold it to hektish, and therefore no chiyuv arba v'chamisha. The Gemara says, 1 second. Hamid the Sefer Rabbi Shimon Havi, Reisha Lav Rabbi Shimon. But 1 second, say here's the problem. The end of our Mishnah explicitly quotes Rabbi Shimon. If the end of the Mishnah is Rabbi Shimon, then ultimately, again, the beginning of the Mishnah cannot be Rabbi Shimon. Rather, Rabbi say, what's the case over here? Bekachim kalim. So Rabbi say the case. So remember, again, we have two different types of karbanos. Kachim kadoshim, kachim kalim. Kachim kadoshim are like a chatos, an asham. Kachim kalim are like shlamim. Shlamim, so Bachar. So the Gemara says, what's the case over here? What's the case that we're referring to over here? Kachim kalim va'ali with Rabbi Yosef Lili. The Amar kachim kalim mamon bailim hu ubir shusei kaime. So Rabbi Yosef Lili holds that kachim kalim are still, because they have a lesser sanctity, therefore they are still considered to be in the possession of, they are considered to be the property of the owner, and therefore considered to be in his possession. In his possession, and therefore halacha l'maisa. Both say therefore halacha l'maisa. Just to plug this in, just to plug this in for just a second. Therefore, if Reuven were to steal an animal from Shimon, and let's say now he were to be makdish that animal as a shlamim, so both say so now even though he's been makdish, it belongs to hektish. It's not considered a sale to hektish. Why not? Because halacha l'maisa, he still retains ownership over that animal. Furthermore, again, if Reuven were to subsequently slaughter it, he also wouldn't be chayiv arba v'chamisha. Why not? Because l'maisa, that animal no longer belongs to Shimon. Okay? Aval kodshei kadoshim mai. But we'll say, but let's say again, Reuven were to sanctify that animal as a form of kodshei kadoshim, as a chatos, let's say, or be the halacha, m'shayim tashlumi dalad v'chamisha. So we'll say if that's the case, it's really interesting. So halacha l'maisa, so we'll say according to this, if Reuven were to steal an animal from Shimon and what be makdish it, let's say as a chatos. So we'll say chatos is kodshei kadoshim. What happens with kodshei kadoshim? Kodshei kadoshim really become the property, the full property of the Beis Hamikdash. So that sounds like that should be the equivalent of what? Of what? Of a sale. If that's a sale, then Reuben should be chayiv for arba v'chamisha. That's what it sounds like you're saying over here. Well, if that's true, adetani reisha ganav v'tavach v'achar kach hekdish mishalin tashlumin dalad v'hei. Then I both say instead of saying the case of where Reuven stole, slaughtered, and then was makdish it, that he has to pay dalad v'hei, which makes sense. Liflog v'lisnei b'didei. Why not go ahead and literally again I will say subdivide the case within one context? When is this so? When is what so? I will say when is it so that if halacha l'maisa you stole an animal, we're makdish it, and then afterwards went ahead and tavaf habachar that you're going to be pater, that's only by kachim kalim, right? Because the item remains in your possession, your domain. Ava b'kodshei kadoshim. But I will say kodshei kadoshim. In other words, if Reuven stole an animal and then was makdish the animal as kodshei kadoshim, higher sanctity karbanos that become the full property of the Beis Hamikdash, that is the equivalent of a sale. Therefore, in that case again, mishalin tashlum arba v'chamisha, you should have to pay 4 and 5 time penalty payment. To which the Gemara says, you're right. Elali olam loshna kodshei kadoshim v'loshna kodshim kalim. So I'll say in reality, there is no distinction. There is no distinction, ultimately, again, between kodshei kadoshim and kodshim kalim. I v'dikakashi lecha mali machro lehedyot mali machro leshamayim. But I will say, but if there's no distinction, I don't understand. I'm still hung up on one core issue, which is, at the end of the day, the act of being makdish something, why is that not the equivalent to a sale? Right? In other words, I will say, at the end of the day, hektish now owns it, right? And the truth is, whether I have responsibility for it or don't have responsibility for it, l'mais, if at the end of the day hektish owns it, why is that not enough to make me chayiv? To which the Gemara says, I'll tell you, meikara tura de Ruvain, v'hashta tura de Shimon. So machal shamayim meikara tura de Ruvain, v'hashta tura de Ruvain. So say, in order for something to, for example, if you sell something, in the beginning, the item belonged to Reuven, the thief, and now Reuven sold it, it belongs to Shimon. Okay, there, we'll call it Levi. I'll say, when you're makdish something, here's what's interesting. When you're makdish something, as much as the Beis Hamikdash becomes the owner, the animal is still known by the name of the owner. Right? So I'll say, think about this just a moment. So if I take a regular case, I take an animal, and I say this animal is a shlamim. So I'll say, so technically speaking, who owns the animal? Who owns the animal? The Beis Hamikdash, right? Technically. But I will say, but when people look at this animal, so to speak, how is this animal known? This is Silber's carbon. Right? So it's this interesting idea. So as much as technical ownership is by the Beis Hamikdash, but yet again, the animal itself is still associated with me as my carbon. It's true. I can't repurpose it for something else. I can't use it for something else, but it's still ultimately, again, known as my animal. So we'll say, so a very interesting distinction. Therefore, I will say, coming full circle, therefore, halacha l'maisa, essentially what the Gemara is saying is, the act of being makdish something is not the equivalent ultimately of selling it. And therefore, again, in this case, the Mishnah, Reuven stole the sheep from Shimon. He was makdish it, and afterwards he slaughters it or sells it. So I will say, so technically speaking, he's only going to be chayiv kefel only going to be chayiv kefal, and he is not going to be chayiv arba v'chamisha. Okay, fascinating. Let's go back to Rabbi Shimon Omer. So remember again, this was the strange statement of Rabbi Shimon at the end of the Mishnah. Rabbi Shimon said, "Kachim shechayiv b'achrayusam m'shayim tashlumin dalad v'hei." Any karbanos that you have responsibility for, you pay dalad v'hei. Any karbanos you don't have responsibility for, you don't pay dalad v'hei. You're pater. Okay, so let's analyze this. The Gemara says, so Rabbi Shimon Omer, Amri nehid desev Rabbi Shimon, mali machro lehedyot, mali machro leshamayim, ipchami b'ayli. So both say, so Rabbi Shimon actually above, right in the conversation above, actually spoke about this idea that the truth is an act of being makdish something should be equivalent to selling it. Right? Rabbi Shimon's lashon was, what does it matter if you sell it to a regular guy, or what does it matter ultimately again if you sell it to the Beis HaMikdash? Either way, one should be chayiv for mechira. To which the Gemara says, "Ipchami b'ayilei." Then the opposite should be true. How so? Kachim shechai b'achri yusan. Any karbanos that you bear responsibility for, dakanti lo nafek mirshu say. That shows, or if you still bear responsibility for it, what does that show? What does that show? That it is still in your rishus, meaning that it hasn't fully left your rishus. Kachim she'ena chai b'achri yusan. On the other hand, kachim that you are not responsible for. So the Gemara says, chayiv demafkile mirshu say. Then we'll say again, if you don't bear responsibility for it, that's a clear indication that what? That when you were makdish it really did leave your domain. Therefore, that's the equivalent, or that's the telltale sign of a real sale. And therefore, ultimately, you should be chayiv arba v'chamisha demafkile mirshu say. Ultimately, because it's left your domain. Reb Shimon, Amri, Reb Shimon Amil Sachrisika. You're right. The truth is, Rabbi Shimon actually is commenting on something totally different. Totally different. What is he commenting on? Here we go. Here's what Reb Shimon is commenting on. Ein hagonev achar haganav meshalein teshlami dalad v'hei. Oh, this is interesting. Reuven steals from Shimon, and then what happens? And now Levi steals from Reuven. Okay? Right? So again, Reuven steals from Shimon, and now Levi steals from Reuven. And now Levi goes out, after Levi steals from Reuven, Levi sells it or slaughters it. Interesting. So essentially, Rabbi Shimon is saying like this: Ein hagonev acher hagan of mishayim tashlumi dalad v'hei. Ultimately, again, a thief who steals from a thief, ultimately again is not chayiv arba v'chamisha. Take a look at Rashi. Actually, not yet. Right? V'chein hagonev hektish mi beis bailim pater. Interesting. I'll say similarly. Let's say Reuven steals a consecrated sheep from Shimon. Right, so Shimon had an animal set aside, had a sheep set aside as a shlamim, and Reuven steals that sheep from Shimon. What's the halacha? Ultimately, again, Reuven's going to be pater. Now, what's the logic in both of these cases? My time, very simple. V'gonev mi beis ha'ish, v'lo mi beis hektish. Rabbi say, when the Torah speaks about liability for theft, right? How does both for kefal as well as for arba v'chamisha? What's the lashon? V'gonev mi beis ha'ish. Rabbi say, gonev beis ha'ish has a dual meaning. Number one, you're stealing something that belongs to the person who you are stealing it from, and number two, you stole it from the original owner. So both say, so therefore, gonev min aganav, right? If Levi steals from Reuven, so Reuven is not the owner. He's a thief, right? So therefore, again, no obligation. Similarly, again, if Reuven steals from Shimon, as much as Shimon is the owner, quote unquote, but since he consecrated it, he's no longer really the owner over this sheep. It belongs to the Beis HaMikdash. That's what Reb Shimon is coming to go ahead and comment on. So that's the halacha. Rabbi Shimon says it depends. What does it depend on? In other words, when we speak about stealing a consecrated animal, is there liability for that or not? Rabbi Shimon will say it really depends. What does it depend on? Rabbi Shimon Omer, Kachim shechai b'achrayusan chayiv. Rabbi Shimon says, no. If Reuven the thief steals from Shimon a consecrated animal, but it's a type of consecrated animal that Shimon has responsibility for. Then in other words, if let's say now that he's going to have to replace it, right? So there's going to have to be responsibility, then ultimately again, Reuven the thief will be chayiv. My timer, what's the reason for that? Karina be v'gonev mi beis ha'ish. Ultimately, again, I will say because that is considered to be an act of theft from the owner, which makes sense. Why? Because since Shimon has responsibility over it, therefore halacha l'maisa is considered to be as if Reuven is stealing something that Shimon owns from Shimon's home. But let's finish up. But if let's say Reuven stole something from Shimon, for which there is no responsibility. In other words, once the item is gone, it's gone, and Shimon doesn't have any responsibility for it, then pater. Then ultimately, again, Reuven will be pater. Why? Ultimately, again, because we can't claim in that case that he stole from the owner. So we'll say, so look at Rashi now for just a moment. Rashi says over here, Dehecha the aktish ganav bein leneder bein lenedava lo mechayve le Rabbi Shimon lav ashayte de hegdish mishum da adayin shmalav v'vasa shaploni v'lav atvicha de hamir shus marei Kamma nafik ella agonev hegdish shekdishu bailim kai. So we'll say, so now we're totally switching this around. We're talking about now a case over here where Reuven the thief stole a consecrated object. So we'll say, therefore again, so we'll say, here's what's happening over here. The Gemara wants to suggest the following, that we have essentially two different opinions over here. The Tana Kamma holds that Allah in general, let's leave the Goniv Minaganav case on the side for just a second. The thief steals from a thief. In general, if Reuven goes into Shimon's house and Reuven steals a sheep that was set aside as a shlomim, right, or an olot, or whatever it is, so ultimately, again, Reuven's not going to be chai for that. Now, again, he's going to be, why? Because the Torah, when it speaks about theft, says, V'gunav mi beis ha'ish. Ultimately, again, you stole it from the house of the owner. But a consecrated item is not considered to be owned by the owner. It's owned by the Beis HaMikdash. Therefore, again, the thief kind of gets off on a technicality. Rabbi Shimon really comes along and says, it really depends. What does it depend on? Is there responsibility? Is there achrayus? Now that the consecrated item was stolen, does the owner have responsibility, replacement responsibility for that consecrated item? If the owner has replacement responsibility, then what? Then it's considered to be his. If the owner does not have replacement responsibility, then it's not considered to be his. That's what Rabbi Shimon is coming to add in over here. Okay, so the Gemara says, Michti, Shamina le Rabbi Shimon, Damar Shchita, Shein Ruya Lashma Shchita. So we'll say, so now let's go back for just a second. We have another position, Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon holds that Shchita Shein Ruya, Lo Shma Shchita. We actually saw this part, we'll say, namely, that a Shchita that does not produce a readily consumable animal, right, readily consumable meat, is not called Shchita. So if that's the case here, we'll say, so therefore, remember again, Rabbi Shimon also holds, remember, you're only chayiv for Tavich and Mechir, you're only chayiv for slaughtering the animal if it produces an animal that is fit for consumption. If it's not fit for consumption, then you're not chayiv for slaughtering it. So the Gemara says, now watch this. So the Gemara says, lo shchita. Kadshim nami shchita she'en ru'yahi. So I understand. If Reuven steals a consecrated animal from Shimon, and then subsequently slaughters it, I will say, this is a shchita she'en ru'ya. Right? If you take a consecrated animal and you shecht it, what can you do with that meat? What can you do with it? Nothing. If that's the case, then why should there be liability in this case regardless? In other words, if Reuven steals a consecrated animal from Shimon, whether Shimon has responsibility, Shimon doesn't have responsibility for it. If Reuven shechts that animal, that's a shchita she'en ru'ya. And a shchita she'en ru'ya, Rabbi Shimon, ultimately doesn't generate liability. It's fascinating. We'll say, what's the case over here? The case over here is, although Reuven stole the consecrated animal from Shimon, he knows that it is Shimon's sacrificial animal. And in fact, what does Reuven do? He takes the animal, digs the animal to the Beis HaMikdash, and shechs it l'shem Shimon. Okay, that's the case of the shechita. So we'll say, so therefore again, this is a shechita ru'uya over here. But if that's the case, we'll say, if that's what happened over here, fari chazra karen l'bailim. We'll say, if that's the case over here, then the truth is, the universe is in perfect equilibrium, right? In other words, what was Shimon going to do with that animal? What was Shimon going to do with the animal? Take it to the Beis HaMikdash and shecht it. So essentially, Reuven did it for him. Chazra karen l'bailim means essentially we should treat it as if the animal was returned to the owner. In other words, we'll say, if that's what Reuven did, that Reuven essentially shechted the animal on Shimon's behalf in the Beis HaMikdash, then Shalom al Yisrael, all is good. All is good. Right? What would be the problem? To which the Gemara says, Rabbi Yitzchak bar Avin shenishbach hadam. We'll say what happened over here. It's actually fascinating. While it's true that Reuven took the carbon to the Beis Hamikdash, shechted it inside of the Beis Hamikdash, the blood spilled before it had a chance to be applied on the Mizbeach. On the Mizbeach. Suppose I say, now remember again, when does a carbon affect atonement? Only when there's Zrika. So here, suppose I say, here's the fascinating. So the Shechita worked out fine. The problem is the carbon, it turns out, is actually totally ineffective. Totally ineffective. Rashi says over here, "Shenishbach Hadam umiu b'shas shchita ru'uyahi." So at the time of the shchita, interestingly enough, time of shchita, it was fine. In other words, it was a shchita ru'uya. Just it turns out that lamaisa, the carbon was not really effective because halacha lamaisa zrika was never done. So this would be an interesting case over here. So the shchita was ru'uya, but yet the carbon itself never actually took effect. Kiyasar Rabin Amar Rabbi Yochanan b'shochet tamimim bifnim shelo l'shem bailim. So you could talk about a case over here. Rava said where Reuven went ahead and stole the animal, right? Brought it to the Beis Hamikdash, shechted it inside of the Beis Hamikdash, but not for the sake of Shimon. So therefore you'd have a case, ultimately again, of a shchita ru'uya. So it is a shchita ru'uya, but it's not chazra karen lebailim. But obviously again, in this case, we don't view it as if the animal was returned to Shimon. Why? Because the carbon was not shechted for Shimon. Look at Rashi, that's Rashi in the daf. Shalol l'shem baleim, Rashi says, he says, the shchita ru'uya hi, the kaimalon kol azvachim shenizbechu shalol l'shman ksherin, v'keren lo chazra l'bailim, the kaimalon shalol olu l'bailim l'shem chova. So even though the carbon itself is technically effective, it doesn't satisfy Shimon's obligation. We'll say Amud Beis, Reish Lakish says, so we'll say, here's what we're trying to figure out over here. We're just trying to figure out cases where halacha l'maisa. Remember, Rabbi Shimon says that halacha l'maisa. Rabbi Shimon says that when Reuven steals a consecrated animal, right, and then Reuven steals a consecrated animal, so is it going to be liability for not? Rabbi Shimon says it depends on, is it the type of animal for which Shimon has achrayus for, right? That was our question. Does Shimon have achrayus for it or not? So Rabbi say, then we're asking, but one second, we have a bigger problem. What's the bigger problem? Rabbi Shimon holds that shchita she'ena ru'uya is lo shma shchita. A shchita that does not produce a proper usable product is not called a shchita. If that's the case, you're never going to be chayiv for dalid vehei in these cases. Ultimately, again, because it's a shchita she'ena ru'uya. We're just trying to show over here of cases of a shchita that's ru'uya, proper shchita, but yet, again, the carbon doesn't count for Shimon, the original owner. So therefore, again, the shchita is fine. So technically, again, therefore, there can be liability. But yet, again, the carbon doesn't count for Shimon. Because obviously, if the carbon counts for Shimon, then Abba said there's not really, quote unquote, like such an act of theft over here. Because at the end of the day, mission was accomplished. So we have to paint for ourselves a case of where Lamaisa, again, the shchita, technically speaking, could work. The shchita works, but Lamaisa, the carbon doesn't count for Shimon. It's another example of this. Reish Lakish says, "B'shochit bali mumin b'chutz." I could be talking about a case of, I have a consecrated animal that has a mum, and halacha l'maisa, you're shechting it outside of the Beis Hamikdash. Outside, which by the way, which is totally fine, right? The halacha is if an animal, a consecrated animal, develops a blemish, one is permitted to go ahead and shecht it outside of the Beis Hamikdash. Tai bar Rabbi Yochanan, shchita materes. Supposed to say in this case over here, right? He had a question: is shchita really the matir? Well, in other words, in these cases of karbanos, shchita is not really the matir, right? It's not shchita ultimately again that causes the item to become permitted. Rather, we'll say what causes a carbon to become permitted follows zrika materes. Ultimately, we'll say by karbanos, it's not the shchita that ultimately again allows for the carbon to be effective. Rather, again, it is the zrika. Rashi says over here, Toi lashon mariach bekankan kimo toi leakankan kolomar diek la Rabbi Lazar parach leRabbi alibed Rabbi Yochanan v'chi shchita sa materes falozrika materes obishas tvicha shchita shein ruhiyis. We'll say the Gemara wants to suggest. The Gemara was suggesting that in all of these cases, when you shecht the carbon in the right way, that's called the shchita ru'uya. But now what the Gemara is saying is that's not really true. It's not shchita ultimately again that permits the animal. They both say what is it that ultimately permits the animal? It's the zrika. Well, if it's the zrika that permits the animal, then the shchita of any carbon should really be what? A shchita she'ena ru'uya. Fascinating idea. If that's the case that it's a shchita she'ena ru'uya, then according to Rabbi Shimon, in every case of a stolen carbon, you should never be chayiv arba v'chamisha, because you're only chayiv arba v'chamisha if it's a shchita ru'uya. But by a carbon, every shchita is going to be a shchita she'ena ru'uya, because it's not the shchita that permits the carbonic animal, but rather, again, it's the zrika. Interesting kind of logic over here. So which the Gemara says, Reish Lakish shchita materes. According to Reish Lakish, is it? Or as I will say, Reish Lakish is the one who set this up as a case ultimately again of Bali Mumin, right? So according to Reish Lakish, is it the shchita that's matir the Baal Mum? It's not the shchita. Valopedia materes. It's the redemption of the animal ultimately again that is the matir. So the Gemara says, Ishtamite had Rabbi Shimon. They forgot the position of Rabbi Shimon. I will say, what does Rabbi Shimon say? Listen to this. It's really fascinating. Rabbi Shimon holds Kala Omed Lizra Kizarak Dami, V'Kala Omed Liftos Kipadui Dami. Rabbi says it's fascinating. Rabbi Shimon holds anytime an animal is fit for zrika, it's as if the zrika has been done. Just like any time an animal is fit for redemption, it's as if it's already been redeemed. I will say, we've seen this concept before, right? Where do we see this concept before? Remember again where we saw it the first time in our journeys in Shas? First time in Shas? You do. You remember, Kalarai lebila, right? In bila ma'akevas, by karban mincha. The halacha by karban mincha is a mincha, which is a flour offering, right? Has to be mixed, right? The flour, the oil, everything. I will say, so what's the halacha if you didn't mix it? You didn't mix it. So what's the halacha? We say kalarai lebila, ein bila ma'akevas, as long as it's fit to be mixed. Ultimately, again, even if you didn't mix it, it's okay. So I'll say, so this is kind of an extension of this model. Rabbi Shimon says, essentially, as long as all of the ingredients are ready for a proper zrika, we could treat it as if the zrika occurred. Now, that doesn't mean you don't have to do the zrika. You do have to do the zrika. But halachically, what he's saying is, it says, if as long as we're ready, all the pieces are in place, we can view it as if the zrika occurred. Right? Pidyon, redemption of injured animals, balimum, as long as all of the ingredients are there, we can view it as if the zrika ultimately the pidyon was done. So therefore, we'll say that's very important. So where do we see this? So let's analyze this. So we'll say, where do we see this concept that anything ultimately again that is fit to be sprinkled, it's as if it's already the zrika has been done. The Sanya Rabbi Shimon Omer Yesh Noser Shumatami to Masochin. Well, at least start this there. We'll say, by the way, don't get we are perfectly on schedule. If you caught a glimpse of tomorrow's Amud Aleph, right? We are way good. That's why I felt we didn't have to didn't have to rush, right? Right, we're fine. We didn't have to rush. Although we'll probably be behind anyway with a daf like this, but okay. We're going to do tostas tomorrow, so we're going to do tostas. So now remember. So let's analyze a bit. So remember. So let's begin this. Rabbi Shimon says like this: Yesh nosar shumatami tumasochlin, v'yesh nosar shenematami tumasochlin. So we'll say nosar. What's nosar? Every carbon has a permitted window of consumption. Right? A failure to consume a carbon within that window of consumption and leaving it over, ultimately again makes it into nosar. So therefore I will say, interestingly enough, there's a type of nosar, ultimately again that is mitame tumasochlin, that contracts tumasochlin, and a type of nosar that doesn't contract. And I will say, no, we'll stop over here for today. We'll pick up in Miras Hashem with nosar tomorrow. Shemen Shekayach to everyone. I'm sorry? I know. Stop over here for today. We have a couple. I have so far. Let me just stop this.